the A Shau Valley. Just speaking those three words was enough to make helicopter pilots in Vietnam go quiet, was enough to make infantry soldiers who'd been there get that 1,000-yard stare, was enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who understood what that valley represented. This wasn't just another valley in Vietnam, wasn't just another area of operations where you might see combat or might have a quiet patrol. The A Shau Valley was different. The A Shau Valley was a meat grinder, a place where the North Vietnamese army had spent 2 years building fortifications and positioning anti-aircraft weapons and preparing defenses that made flying into that valley feel like flying into a steel wall of bullets and rockets and explosions. By August of 1968, the A Shau Valley had already earned its reputation as the most dangerous place in Vietnam for helicopter operations. Earlier that year, during Operation Delaware in April and May, the 1st Cavalry Division had lost 10 helicopters shot down on the first day alone when they'd assaulted into the valley. 10 helicopters, one day. That wasn't normal, even by Vietnam standards, where helicopters got shot at constantly, and where losing aircraft to enemy fire was a regular occurrence. But the A Shau was on another level entirely, because the North Vietnamese had packed that valley with anti-aircraft weapons, had positioned them on the ridgelines overlooking the valley floor, had hidden them in the jungle where they couldn't be spotted from the air, had radar-controlled guns that could track aircraft and shoot them down with devastating accuracy. And now, in early August of '68, American commanders had decided to go back, had decided that despite everything that had happened during Delaware, despite the helicopters that had been shot down and the casualties that had been taken, they needed to conduct another operation in the A Shau Valley because intelligence indicated the North. Vietnamese were using the valley again to stage supplies and troops for attacks elsewhere in the War Corps. The mission would fall to the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, and the operation would be called Somerset Plain. It would last 17 days. It would send thousands of American and South Vietnamese soldiers into that valley. And for the men loading onto helicopters at Firebase Birmingham on the morning of August 4th, 1968, there was no escaping the knowledge that they were about to fly into the most dangerous airspace in Vietnam. Specialist Michael Torres sat in the open door of the Huey, his rifle between his knees, watching the Green Mountains pass below as the helicopter flew west toward the A Shau. He'd been in Vietnam for 6 months, had seen combat before, had been shot at, and had shot back. But this felt different. Everyone in his platoon had heard the stories about the A Shau, had heard about Delaware, had heard about the anti-aircraft fire. That was so thick you could supposedly walk on the tracers. Torres wasn't sure if that last part was true, but he knew enough veterans who'd been in the valley to know that the danger was real and that some of the men in these helicopters wouldn't be coming back. He just hoped he wouldn't be one of them. The door gunner on Torres's helicopter kept his hand on the .50 caliber machine gun, constantly scanning the jungle below for any sign of enemy activity, for any muzzle flash or tracer round that would indicate they were taking fire. The pilots flew the Huey aggressively, not in a straight line, but weaving slightly, changing altitude unpredictably, doing everything they could to make themselves harder targets for the gunners they knew were waiting somewhere in those mountains. And every soldier in that helicopter, all 8 infantry soldiers plus the 4-man crew, understood that the next few minutes would be critical, that the landing zone might be hot, that they might start taking fire the moment the helicopter began its descent, and that their survival depended on getting out of that aircraft and finding cover as quickly as possible. This is the story of Operation Somerset Plain, the August 1968 return to the A Shau Valley. 17 days of combat operations in terrain that had already consumed so many American lives. 17 days of searching for an enemy who knew the ground better than any American ever would. 17 days of heat and jungle and fear, and the constant awareness that the valley wanted to kill you, and that the only question was whether you'd be smart enough and lucky enough to get out alive. To understand why American commanders kept sending soldiers into the A Shau Valley despite its terrible reputation, you need to understand the valley's strategic importance to the North Vietnamese war effort. The A Shau ran roughly north to south for about 45 kilometers along the border with Laos in Thu Thien Province, putting it in the northern part of South Vietnam in the area designated as I Corps, The valley itself was relatively flat compared to the mountains that bordered it on both sides, mountains that rose 3,000 to 5,000 feet above the valley floor, and that were covered in triple-canopy jungle so thick that American reconnaissance aircraft couldn't see through it to spot what was hidden beneath. What made the A Shau strategically critical was its direct connection to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of roads and trails that ran through Laos and Cambodia, and that the North Vietnamese used to move troops and supplies from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. The trail system had branches that fed into the A Shau Valley, which meant that supplies coming down from the north could be moved into the valley, could be staged there, could be distributed from there to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units operating throughout the northern provinces. The valley functioned as a logistics hub, a place where the North Vietnamese could accumulate supplies before pushing them out to units in the field, where they could rest and refit units that had taken casualties, where they could stage forces before launching attacks against American and South Vietnamese positions. The North Vietnamese had been in control of the A Shau Valley since March of 1966, when they'd overrun a special forces camp at A Shau, in a brutal battle that had seen desperate hand-to-hand fighting and a chaotic evacuation under fire. After that battle, after the camp fell, American forces had essentially abandoned the valley to North Vietnamese control, hadn't maintained any permanent presence there, and for 2 years, the Communists had used that time to transform the valley into one of their most important facilities in all of South Vietnam. They'd built roads through the valley, roads that were camouflaged during the day, but that could be used at night to move trucks loaded with supplies. They'd constructed hundreds of bunkers and underground facilities where they could store ammunition and weapons and food. They'd built barracks and command posts and maintenance facilities. They'd turned the A Shau Valley into a major military installation hidden beneath the jungle canopy. But what really made the valley dangerous, what gave it the reputation that made American soldiers dread going there, was the anti-aircraft defenses. The North Vietnamese had spent 2 years positioning anti-aircraft weapons throughout the valley and in the mountains surrounding it. They had radar-controlled 37mm cannons that could track aircraft and engage them with frightening accuracy. They had rapid-firing 23mm guns that could throw up walls of fire. They had 12.7mm heavy machine guns on the ridgelines. They had soldiers with AK-47s who'd been trained to lead helicopters and to shoot at vulnerable spots like the engines, and the fuel tanks. The result was an air defense network that was denser and more sophisticated than anything else American forces faced in Vietnam, and that made every helicopter flight into or out of the valley a life-threatening experience. American commanders understood all of this, understood the danger, but they also understood that allowing the North Vietnamese to use the A Shau Valley without interference was unacceptable because the valley fed enemy operations throughout Encore, including attacks on Hue and on the Marine positions near the demilitarized zone. So, despite the danger, despite the losses that previous operations had suffered, the decision was made in early August of '68 to go back into the valley, to conduct another raid designed to disrupt enemy logistics and to destroy whatever supplies and facilities could be found. Operation Delaware had been the previous major American operation in the A Shau Valley, conducted in April and May of '68 by the 1st Cavalry Division, and anyone planning Somerset Plain had to study what had happened during Delaware because those lessons were written in American blood. Delaware had been a massive operation, a full division assault into the valley, and it had achieved some success in terms of capturing enemy supplies and disrupting operations. But it had paid a terrible price. The first day of Delaware had seen 10 helicopters shot down, an absolutely catastrophic loss rate that had shocked commanders and that had nearly caused the operation to be called off before it had really begun. The helicopter crews flying into the valley during Delaware had described the anti-aircraft fire as the most intense they'd ever experienced, had described seeing tracers coming from multiple directions simultaneously, had described the sound of bullets hitting their aircraft, the sickening feeling when controls stopped responding, the terror of auto-rotating down into triple-canopy jungle, knowing that even if you survived the crash landing, you might be captured or killed by enemy forces before rescue could arrive. Some helicopters had made it back to base despite taking dozens of hits. testament to both the durability of the Huey and the skill of the pilots who'd kept them flying despite battle damage. Other helicopters had gone down hard, had crashed in the jungle, and their crews had either been killed in the crash or had been rescued in dramatic operations that had required more helicopters to fly into the same fire that had shot down the original aircraft. Delaware had lasted nearly a month, from April 19th through May 17th. And during that time, American forces had discovered just how thoroughly the North Vietnamese had fortified the A Shau. They'd found bunker complexes that could withstand direct hits from 500-pound bombs. They'd found caves full of supplies. They'd found trucks hidden under the jungle canopy. They'd found a damaged PT-76 light tank, proof that the North Vietnamese had even moved armor into the valley. They'd captured huge quantities of weapons and ammunition, had destroyed what they could, but they'd also recognized that what they'd found was probably just a fraction of what was actually there, because the jungle was so thick and the valley was so large that searching it thoroughly was nearly impossible. By the time Delaware ended in mid-May, the 1st Cavalry Division had killed over 500 North Vietnamese, according to American body counts, had captured massive amounts of supplies, had disrupted enemy operations, but had also lost 142 Americans killed and had suffered countless wounded. The division had pulled out of the valley exhausted, their helicopters shot full of holes, their infantry battalions under strength from casualties, and everyone who'd been there understood that the North Vietnamese would simply move back into the valley once American forces left and would resume their operations. And that's exactly what happened. By August, just 3 months after Delaware ended, intelligence reports indicated the North Vietnamese were back in force, were using the valley again, and American commanders decided another operation was necessary. The planning for Operation Somerset Plain incorporated the hard lessons from Delaware. The operation would be smaller, would use the 101st Airborne Division's 1st Brigade rather than an entire division. The preparatory fires would be more extensive, with B-52 strikes and artillery bombardment designed to suppress anti-aircraft positions before helicopters went in. The landing zones would be selected more carefully based on what had been learned about where anti-aircraft fire was heaviest. And there would be realistic expectations about what could be achieved, with planners understanding that Somerset Plain would be a raid rather than an occupation, that American forces would go in, would search for enemy forces and supplies, and would pull out after a couple of weeks, rather than trying to maintain a long-term presence in a valley that was essentially indefensible given the proximity to Laos and the ease with which the enemy could bring in reinforcements. The soldiers who would fight Operation Somerset Plain came from the 101st Airborne Division, a unit with a proud history stretching back to World War II when they'd parachuted into Normandy on D-Day and had fought through Europe, earning a reputation as elite troops. The division's shoulder patch showed a Screaming Eagle's head, and their soldiers were called Screaming Eagles, a nickname they carried with pride. By 1968, the division had been in Vietnam for over a year, had fought during the Tet Offensive when they had helped defend Hue, had conducted countless operations in the mountains and jungles of our Corps, and had proven themselves as capable as any unit in Vietnam. The division was commanded by Major General Melvin Zayas, a West Point graduate who'd been a company commander in World War II, and who'd risen through the ranks to division command. Zayas understood the challenges his soldiers faced, understood the difficulty of the terrain they operated in, understood that the enemy they fought was skilled and determined and willing to accept casualties that would be unthinkable to American commanders. He also understood that political pressure back home was growing, that the American public was increasingly questioning the war after Tet, and that military victories needed to be achieved efficiently and with minimal American casualties if public support was to be maintained. For Operation Somerset Plain, the main effort would come from the division's 1st Brigade commanded by Colonel Joseph Conmee. The brigade included experienced battalions that had been fighting in Vietnam for months, soldiers who understood jungle warfare, who'd learned to move quietly through terrain where visibility was measured in feet, who'd learned to set up ambushes and to avoid being ambushed themselves, who'd learned to survive in an environment where everything from the terrain to the climate to the enemy was trying to kill them. These weren't the green troops who'd arrived in Vietnam months earlier, not knowing what to expect. These were hardened combat veterans who understood the war they were fighting, even if they didn't always understand why they were fighting it. The soldiers preparing for Somerset Plain in early August came from different backgrounds, from different parts of America, from different economic classes, but they shared the common experience of having volunteered or been drafted into the Army, having completed training, having been sent to Vietnam, and having joined the 101st Airborne, where they'd been forged into combat soldiers through the brutal experience of actually fighting. Some were on their first tours, serving the standard 12 or 13 months before they'd rotate home. Others were on second or even third tours, professional soldiers who'd chosen to come back to Vietnam, either because they believed in the mission, or because they were good at combat and found purpose in it, or because they'd been ordered back. What united them all was the knowledge that Somerset Plain would take them into the A Shau Valley, and every one of them understood what that meant. They'd heard the stories, they'd talked to veterans of Delaware, they knew about the anti-aircraft fire and the casualties and the helicopters that had been shot down, and they were going anyway because that's what soldiers do, because when you're ordered to conduct an operation, you conduct the operation regardless of how you feel about it. Because your loyalty is to the men in your unit and to the mission and to the idea that you'll do your job professionally even when that job involves flying into some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. The operational plan for Somerset Plain was designed to get American forces into the valley quickly, to conduct aggressive search and destroy operations for about 2 weeks, and then to extract before the enemy could mass forces for a major counterattack. The operation would begin on August 4th with helicopter assaults into landing zones near the abandoned A Luoi Special Forces camp, the same camp that had fallen in '66 and that had been in ruins ever since. The choice of landing zones was based on intelligence about where anti-aircraft positions were concentrated, and on terrain analysis that identified areas where helicopters could land and where defending forces could establish security quickly. Before any helicopters lifted off, before any soldiers loaded up, the valley would be pounded with preparatory fires designed to suppress enemy air defenses and to kill or drive off North Vietnamese forces in the landing zones. Artillery from Firebase Berchtesgaden and Firebase Georgia, fire bases that had been built on ridgelines specifically to provide fire support for operations in the A Shau, would hammer the valley with hundreds of rounds of high explosive shells. Air Force and Navy tactical aircraft would conduct strikes, dropping bombs and napalm on suspected enemy positions. And B-52 bombers would conduct arc light strikes, carpet bombing large areas of the valley with the idea that even if you couldn't see the enemy beneath the jungle canopy, dropping enough bombs would kill whoever was there. There was also going to be a unique element to Somerset Plain that hadn't been tried before in the A Shau. American forces would drop CS tear gas at 3 main routes that led into the valley from Laos, the idea being that the gas would contaminate these routes and would make it difficult for the North Vietnamese to use them to bring in reinforcements or to evacuate supplies. Whether this would actually work was anybody's guess. The North Vietnamese had gas masks and had shown throughout the war that they could operate in environments that would stop most other forces. But it was worth trying, and if nothing else, it might slow down their movement and might create confusion during the critical first days of the operation, when American forces were most vulnerable. The American ground forces would be supplemented by South Vietnamese troops from the ARVN 1st Division, one of the better South Vietnamese units, who would conduct their own operation called Lam Son 246 in the southern part of the valley. The ARVN troops would be searching for enemy forces and supplies just like the Americans, and the coordination between American and South Vietnamese forces would be critical because friendly fire incidents happened when different units didn't know exactly where each other were. And in terrain as difficult as the A Shau Valley, where visibility was limited and where confusion was constant, the risk of American and South Vietnamese forces accidentally engaging each other was real and had to be carefully managed. The exit strategy was built into the plan from the beginning. Somerset Plain would not be an attempt to hold the A Shau Valley permanently. American commanders had learned from Delaware that trying to maintain a presence in the valley was nearly impossible given the proximity to Laos, and given the enemy's ability to bring in forces through routes that American troops weren't permitted to cross into Laos to interdict. So, Somerset Plain would be a raid. American forces would go in, would do as much damage as they could, would gather intelligence, and would pull out after about 2 weeks. The North Vietnamese would move back in after American forces left, But that was acceptable because the point was to disrupt their operations and to keep them off balance, not to permanently occupy terrain that couldn't be defended. The morning of August 4th, 1968, began with the sound of artillery. At Firebase Berchtesgaden and Firebase Georgia, Americans, gunners worked their howitzers in a carefully choreographed fire mission, sending shell after shell arcing over the mountains and down into the A Shau Valley below. High explosive rounds detonated in the jungle, creating blast waves that snapped trees and that would kill anyone caught in the kill radius. White phosphorus rounds burst in the air, creating clouds of burning particles that would set the jungle on fire and that would force enemy soldiers to abandon their positions or burn alive. The artillery bombardment continued for hours, thousands of pounds of explosives being dropped on a valley that was about to be invaded by American infantry. While the artillery pounded the valley, Air Force F-4 Phantoms and Navy A-4 Skyhawks conducted bombing runs, their pilots pushing through clouds and morning haze to put ordnance on targets that had been selected, based on intelligence reports and on lessons from Delaware. Some pilots dropped conventional bombs, 500-pounders and 750-pounders that cratered the earth and that destroyed bunkers and that killed anyone unlucky enough to be nearby. Other pilots dropped napalm, jellied gasoline that stuck to everything it touched and that burned at temperatures hot enough to consume oxygen and suffocate anyone in the area, even if they weren't directly hit by the flames. The napalm created massive fireballs that rose above the jungle canopy, and the smoke from those fires drifted across the valley, creating an eerie orange haze. Then came the B-52s. The big strategic bombers flew so high they couldn't be seen from the ground, couldn't be heard until their bombs were already falling, and when those bombs hit, they created devastating rectangular patterns of destruction that obliterated everything within the target box. Each B-52 carried dozens of bombs, and when multiple B-52s struck the same area, the result was moonscape, a landscape so cratered and torn up that nothing recognizable remained. The psychological impact of B-52 strikes on enemy forces was enormous because there was no warning, no way to take cover, no way to fight back, just sudden annihilation from an enemy that you couldn't see or hear until it was too late. By late morning, the preparatory fires were complete, and it was time for the infantry to go in. At Firebase Birmingham, soldiers from the 1st Brigade loaded onto Huey helicopters, checking their weapons one last time, making sure their gear was secure, trying not to think too much about what was waiting for them in the valley. The helicopters lifted off in waves, their turbine engines whining as the pilots applied power and pulled pitch. And soon the sky was full of Hueys flying in formation toward the A Shau Valley. Door gunners manned their weapons, scanning the jungle below for any sign of enemy activity. The infantry soldiers sat with their rifles between their knees, some of them joking nervously, others silent and focused, all of them aware that the next few minutes might be the most dangerous of their lives. As the helicopters approached the landing zones near A Luoi, the pilots tightened their formations and began their descents. The door gunners opened fire, their machine guns chattering as they hosed down the tree lines around the landing zones. Suppressive fire designed to keep enemy heads down, while the helicopters were most vulnerable. The infantry soldiers moved to the edge of the helicopter doors, ready to jump out the moment the skids touched ground. And then, the helicopters flared, the pilots pulling back on the cyclic to bleed off speed, and the aircraft settled onto the landing zones with a thump. The soldiers jumped out and ran, spreading out quickly to establish a perimeter, their eyes scanning for enemy positions, their fingers on their triggers. And there was almost no enemy fire. The landing zones were not hot. The anti-aircraft fire that everyone had feared, the fire that had shot down 10 helicopters on the first day of Delaware, didn't materialize. A few rounds of small arms fire, nothing serious, nothing that prevented the insertions from being completed. Wave after wave of helicopters came in, bringing more soldiers, bringing supplies, bringing all the equipment needed to establish a position in the valley. By the end of August 4th, the 1st Brigade had successfully landed in the A Shau Valley and had established security around their positions. Only one helicopter had been forced down by enemy fire, a gunship that had taken hits but had managed to make a controlled landing and whose crew had been quickly recovered. The lack of heavy resistance on the first day was both encouraging and mysterious. Had the preparatory fires been that effective at suppressing enemy air defenses? Had the North Vietnamese withdrawn their forces from the valley before the operation began? Were they waiting to see what American forces would do before committing to engagement? Nobody knew for sure, but everyone understood that just because the first day had been relatively easy didn't mean the rest of the operation would be. The A Shau Valley had a way of lulling you into complacency and then killing you when you least expected it. August 5th brought the insertion of South Vietnamese forces into the southern part of the valley. ARVN soldiers from the 1st Division being flown in by American helicopters to conduct their part of the operation. The ARVN troops were professionals, soldiers who'd been fighting longer than most Americans and who understood the terrain and the enemy better than any outsider ever could. But they also carried the burden of knowing that they were fighting a war where their own government's legitimacy was questioned and where corruption and political interference often undermined military operations. Despite these challenges, the ARVN troops who landed in the A Shau on August 5th were determined to prove themselves, to show that South Vietnamese forces could operate effectively in difficult terrain, to demonstrate that Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibilities from American to South Vietnamese forces, could actually work. On August 6th, the ARVN Hoc Bao Company arrived in the valley, the Black Panthers, an elite reconnaissance unit that had a reputation as one of the best South Vietnamese units in the entire war. The Hoc Bao would conduct long-range patrols, would push deeper into the valley than the main force units, would locate enemy positions and supply caches, and would provide the kind of aggressive reconnaissance that was essential for understanding what was actually in the valley and where the North Vietnamese had positioned their forces and supplies. With all American and South Vietnamese forces now in the valley, Operation Somerset Plain transitioned from the insertion phase to the search and destroy phase, and that meant patrols, constant patrols, units moving through the jungle looking for the enemy, checking abandoned bunkers, following trails, searching for the supply caches that intelligence suggested should be in the valley. The patrols were exhausting work. The jungle was incredibly thick, so thick that machetes were needed to cut through vines and undergrowth. The heat was oppressive, temperatures in the 90s with humidity that made it feel even hotter, and soldiers sweated through their uniforms within minutes of starting a patrol. The terrain was steep in places, ridgelines and ravines that had to be climbed or descended, and with each soldier carrying 60 or 70 pounds of equipment, the physical demands were enormous. Visibility on the patrols was often limited to just a few meters because the vegetation was so dense. This meant that patrols moved slowly, carefully, constantly alert for any sign of the enemy who might be watching from concealed positions just meters away. The point man, the soldier who walked first, carried tremendous responsibility because he'd be the first to encounter any enemy force or any booby trap, and walking point in the A Shau Valley required nerves of steel and constant focus because one wrong step could trigger a mine or could walk the patrol into an ambush. Point men rotated frequently because the psychological stress was more than most soldiers could sustain for long periods. During these first days of patrols, contact with the enemy was sporadic. Occasional rifle shots from distant positions, quick exchanges of fire that ended as quickly as they started when the enemy broke contact and melted back into the jungle. Evidence of recent enemy presence was found, fighting positions that had been prepared but were currently empty. Trails that showed signs of recent use, fire pits with ashes that were still warm. These discoveries indicated that North Vietnamese forces were in the valley or had been recently, but the lack of sustained combat suggested they were avoiding engagement, a pattern that would continue through much of Somerset Plain. For the soldiers conducting Somerset Plain, every day in the A Shau Valley was a test of endurance and adaptability. Living conditions were primitive at best. There were no comfortable base camps, no hot meals, no showers or clean clothes. Soldiers slept on the ground, using poncho liners as blankets, half the unit awake at all times on watch because night was when the enemy preferred to attack. They ate sea rations, canned meals that were barely edible when cold and not much better when heated, though heating them meant building small fires that created smoke that could give away your position to the enemy. Water was a constant concern. Each soldier carried several canteens, but water was heavy, and in the heat and humidity of the jungle, you could drink several liters a day just to stay hydrated. Resupply helicopters would bring in water in large containers called water buffaloes, but helicopter resupply wasn't guaranteed because the weather could ground aircraft, or because enemy fire could make landing zones too dangerous to use. This meant that soldiers sometimes had to ration water, had to decide whether to take a full drink or to take just a sip to make the water last longer. Decisions that could mean the difference between staying combat effective and succumbing to heat exhaustion. The jungle itself was hostile in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy. Leeches were everywhere, blood-sucking worms that would attach to any exposed skin, and that had to be burned off with cigarettes because pulling them off would leave their heads embedded in your skin where they could cause infections. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly, and malaria was a real threat despite the anti-malarial pills that soldiers were supposed to take daily. There were snakes in the jungle, some of them venomous, and there were insects that bit and stung and that made every moment uncomfortable. There were thorns on plants that would slice through clothing and skin. There were rivers and streams that had to be forded, and getting wet meant your feet would stay wet for days, which meant foot rot and fungal infections and painful sores. The psychological toll of operating in the A Shau Valley was as significant as the physical toll, the constant alertness required to survive, the knowledge that the enemy could be anywhere, the awareness that your position could be mortared or attacked at any time, the lack of sleep and the physical exhaustion and the heat and the discomfort, all of this created stress that accumulated day after day. Some soldiers handled it better than others. Some had mental toughness that allowed them to compartmentalize the stress and to focus on the mission. Others struggled, and leaders had to watch for signs that soldiers were reaching their breaking points, that they were becoming liabilities rather than assets. Unit cohesion was critical for survival in the A Shau. The bonds between soldiers, the trust that you had in the men beside you, the knowledge that they would cover you and that you would cover them, this was what allowed units to operate effectively in conditions that would break individuals. Soldiers looked out for each other, shared supplies when someone ran low, took care of buddies who were sick or injured, covered for each other during the night watches when exhaustion made it hard to stay alert. These bonds transcended whatever differences the soldiers might have had in background or personality, because in the jungle of the A Shau Valley, none of that mattered. All that mattered was whether you could be counted on when things went bad. For the first week of Operation Somerset Plain, contact with the enemy had been light, sporadic exchanges of fire that didn't develop into sustained engagements. This changed on the night of August 10th going into August 11th, when North Vietnamese forces attacked the ARVN 3rd Battalion, 1st Infantry Regiment in what would be the heaviest fighting of the entire operation. The attack came around midnight, typical North Vietnamese tactics that used darkness to reduce American air support and to create confusion on the battlefield. The attack began with mortar fire, incoming rounds that detonated in and around the ARVN positions, the explosions throwing dirt and shrapnel and creating chaos as soldiers scrambled for cover. The mortar fire was followed within minutes by small arms fire and grenades as North Vietnamese infantry assaulted the ARVN perimeter. Soldiers running forward through the jungle, firing their AK-47s, throwing grenades, trying to get close enough to penetrate the defensive line. The ARVN soldiers returned fire with everything they had: M16s and M60 machine guns, and M79 grenade launchers, creating their own wall of fire that met the attacking North Vietnamese forces. The fighting was intense. Desperate close-quarters combat in some sections where North Vietnamese soldiers got close enough to the defensive perimeter that the fighting was at, ranges measured in meters rather than tens of meters. ARVN soldiers fired on full automatic, burned through magazines rapidly, reloaded, and kept firing. Leaders shouted orders, trying to coordinate the defense, trying to identify where the attack was strongest, trying to shift forces to reinforce weak points in the perimeter. American artillery from Firebase Berchtesgaden responded to calls for fire support, guns firing mission after mission, shells landing in the jungle around the ARVN position, danger close fires that killed attacking North Vietnamese soldiers, but that also created risk for the defenders. Illumination rounds were fired, artillery shells that burst high in the air, and deployed parachute flares that lit up the battlefield with harsh white light that turned night into day and that cast stark shadows. In the light from the flares, the defenders could see North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the jungle, could identify targets, could direct fire more effectively. But the flares also revealed just how many attackers there were, revealed that this wasn't a probe or a small raid, but a serious attack by forces that appeared to be battalion strength or larger. The battle continued for hours, with multiple waves of North Vietnamese attacks being repelled by ARVN defenders who fought with courage and determination. By dawn, the attackers had withdrawn, had broken contact, and had melted back into the jungle, carrying their wounded with them and leaving their dead on the battlefield. The ARVN soldiers who defended through the night were exhausted, were shaking from adrenaline and fear and the physical toll of hours of combat. But they had held their position, and they'd inflicted significant casualties on the enemy. The price had been high, though. ARVN casualties included killed and wounded, soldiers who'd fought bravely and who'd paid the price. 3 days after the night battle, on August 13th, Operation Somerset Plain experienced one of the tragedies that haunted every combined operation. One of those incidents that demonstrated the risks of having multiple forces operating in close proximity with artillery and air support being called in constantly. An American artillery round fired from Firebase Berchtesgaden fell short of its intended target and hit an ARVN position, killing 8 South Vietnamese soldiers instantly. The sound of incoming artillery when you weren't expecting it, when you thought you were safe in your own position, was terrifying beyond description. There was the whistle of the incoming round, that distinctive sound that made experienced soldiers hit the ground. And then the explosion. The blast wave that felt like being punched by a giant fist. The shrapnel that cut through anything in its path. The dirt and debris raining down, and then the screaming. The screaming of wounded men, the frantic shouts for medics, the chaos and confusion as soldiers tried to figure out what had happened and whether more rounds were coming. 8 ARVN soldiers were dead. Just dead. Not killed in combat with the enemy, not killed in a battle where they'd been fighting, and where death, while tragic, at least made some kind of sense in the context of war. These soldiers had been killed by their own side's weapons, had been killed by Americans who were supposed to be helping them, had died because of a mistake, an error in calculation or coordination or communication. For the survivors in that ARVN unit, for the friends of the men who'd been killed, the friendly fire incident was devastating, was a betrayal even if nobody had intended for it to happen, was proof that in war you couldn't even trust your own side to not kill you. American commanders immediately ordered an investigation, trying to determine what had gone wrong. Had the grid coordinates been transmitted incorrectly? Had there been an error in the fire direction center where artillery missions were calculated? Had the gun crew made a mistake in laying the gun? Had weather or other factors affected the trajectory of the round? The investigation would take time and would eventually produce findings and recommendations, but for the families of the 8 ARVN soldiers who'd been killed, no investigation could bring back their loved ones, couldn't undo the fact that they died because of American artillery. The friendly fire incident during Somerset Plain added to the casualty count in the most painful way possible. Because these deaths could have been prevented, because they represented failures in the systems and procedures that were supposed to protect friendly forces, because they highlighted the inherent risks of combined operations, where American and South Vietnamese forces were operating in close proximity, and where the potential for tragic mistakes was always present. For the remainder of the operation, artillery fire missions were reviewed with extra care, with multiple checks to ensure that coordinates were correct and that friendly forces weren't in danger, but the damage to trust and to morale had been done. Through the middle of August, after the night battle and after the friendly fire incident, Operation Somerset Plain continued with American and South Vietnamese forces maintaining their presence in the valley and conducting patrols and searches, though the operational tempo had decreased somewhat, as it became clear that major combat was unlikely, and that the North Vietnamese were avoiding engagement rather than defending the valley in strength. The focus shifted toward finding and destroying supply caches, toward gathering intelligence, toward mapping the valley's trails and roads, toward understanding how the North Vietnamese were using the valley so that future operations could be planned more effectively. Some supply caches were discovered during this period. Stockpiles of ammunition, AK-47 rifles, grenades, rockets, mortar, rounds, all the materials of war that the North Vietnamese needed to conduct operations. When caches were found, they were cataloged for intelligence purposes, photographed to document what types of weapons and supplies the enemy was using, and then destroyed. Small caches might be destroyed with grenades or with thermite grenades that burned hot enough to melt weapons. Larger caches required satchel charges, explosive devices that could be placed among the supplies and then detonated from a safe distance. The largest caches required airstrikes, bombs dropped from aircraft that created massive explosions and that consumed everything in the blast radius. But the quantities of supplies discovered during Somerset Plain were modest, far less than what had been found during Delaware, far less than what intelligence had suggested should be in the valley. This suggested several possibilities. Maybe the North Vietnamese had moved their supplies out of the valley before the operation began, had gotten warning through their intelligence network that an American operation was coming, and had evacuated their major stockpiles. Maybe the supplies were hidden so effectively that American and South Vietnamese forces simply couldn't find them despite intensive searches. Maybe the intelligence had been wrong about how much the North Vietnamese were storing in the valley. Whatever the explanation, the modest results were frustrating for commanders who'd hoped that Somerset Plain would achieve more significant disruption of enemy logistics. The soldiers conducting the patrols during this period continued to deal with the daily challenges of operating in the A Shau, the heat and the jungle, and the constant vigilance required to avoid walking into an ambush or stepping on a mine. Morale remained generally good, despite the difficult conditions, partly because casualties had been relatively light compared to what had been feared, partly because soldiers knew the operation wouldn't last forever, and that they'd soon be extracted from the valley, and partly because the unit cohesion and leadership within the 101st Airborne and within the ARVN units held up well under stress. But there was also a sense of frustration that the operation hadn't achieved more decisive results, that the enemy had largely avoided engagement, that the valley would remain under North Vietnamese control after American forces withdrew. On August 16th, Operation Somerset Plain included a mission that represented the cutting edge of technological warfare in Vietnam, an effort to use electronic sensors and remote monitoring to track enemy movement through the A Shau Valley even after American forces withdrew. Long-range reconnaissance teams and combat engineers were tasked with placing acoustic and seismic sensors at key passes where trails from Laos entered the valley. Sensors that would detect movement and would transmit data back to Firebase Berchtesgaden, where analysts could determine when enemy forces were using the routes. The mission to place the sensors was dangerous because it required small teams to operate far from friendly forces, to move into areas where North Vietnamese troops might be present, to place the sensors in concealed locations where they wouldn't be easily discovered, and to do all of this quietly and quickly and then get out before the enemy knew they'd been there. The teams moved carefully through the jungle, using stealth rather than firepower, avoiding contact whenever possible because their mission was to place sensors, not to engage in combat. Along with the sensors, the teams also placed delayed fuse mines at some of the key choke points, mines that would detonate hours or even days after being armed. Mines designed to kill North Vietnamese soldiers using the trails and to create fear and uncertainty about which routes were safe to use. The delayed fuses meant that the teams placing the mines would be long gone when the explosions occurred, reducing the risk of immediate retaliation, but also raising ethical questions about weapons that might kill civilians using the same trails, or that might kill someone days later who had no way of knowing the mine was there. The sensor program was part of a broader American effort to use technology to compensate for the limitations of ground forces that couldn't be everywhere at once and that couldn't maintain constant surveillance of areas like the A Shau Valley. The sensors would transmit data indicating when something was moving on the trails, and the data could be used to direct airstrikes or artillery fires on enemy forces as they moved through the monitored areas. In theory, the sensors would allow American forces to interdict North Vietnamese movement even without having troops physically present in the valley. In practice, the effectiveness of the sensor program was limited. The North Vietnamese learned to recognize and avoid the sensors once they discovered them. They learned to move during weather conditions when the sensors were less reliable. They accepted some casualties from the sensor-directed strikes and continued operating anyway, and the sensors required maintenance and eventually batteries would die or weather would damage the equipment, and the system would degrade unless someone went back into the valley to replace or repair the sensors, which created a cycle of dangerous missions to maintain a system that provided limited intelligence. But the sensors placed during Somerset Plain would provide some useful data in the months that followed, and the mission to place them was considered successful even if the overall strategic impact was debatable. On August 17th, the extraction of American and South Vietnamese forces from the A Shau Valley began. Helicopters returned to the valley, landing at the same landing zones where they'd inserted forces 2 weeks earlier, and soldiers who'd spent those 2 weeks living in the jungle loaded onto the aircraft with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The withdrawal was conducted systematically, with units being extracted in sequence while other units maintained security, ensuring that the remaining forces weren't left vulnerable as overall strength in the valley decreased. The fact that the withdrawal proceeded without significant enemy interference was notable, because there had been concern that the North Vietnamese would attack during the extraction, when American forces were most vulnerable, when soldiers were focused on getting onto helicopters rather than on maintaining security, when the normal defensive posture was relaxed. But no major attacks came. There were occasional sniper shots, harassing fire that didn't prevent the extraction from proceeding, but nothing that suggested the enemy was committing significant forces to contesting the withdrawal. For the soldiers being extracted, the moment when their helicopter lifted off from the landing zone and gained altitude and began flying east away from the A Shau Valley was a moment of profound relief. They'd survived. They'd spent 2 weeks in one of the most dangerous places in Vietnam, and they were going home, back to Firebase Birmingham, or back to base camps where they could shower and sleep in beds and eat hot food, and not have to worry constantly about being mortared or ambushed. Some soldiers slept during the flight out, the combination of exhaustion and relief and the vibration of the helicopter lulling them into unconsciousness. Others stared out the doors at the jungle passing below, processing what they'd experienced, thinking about friends who'd been killed or wounded, wondering if they'd ever have to go back. The extraction continued through August 18th, 19th, and 20th, with helicopter after helicopter shuttling soldiers and equipment out of the valley. By August 20th, all American and South Vietnamese forces had been withdrawn, and Operation Somerset Plain was officially over. The A Shau Valley was once again under North Vietnamese control, once again available for them to use as a logistics hub and staging area. Once again, the most dangerous piece of terrain in Vietnam for any American force that might be ordered to go back there. The final casualty figures from Operation Somerset Plain told the story of an operation that had been far less bloody than Delaware, but that had still cost American and South Vietnamese lives. 7 Americans had been killed during the 17 days of the operation. 7 soldiers who'd loaded onto helicopters on August 4th and who hadn't come home, whose bodies had been evacuated in plastic bags, whose families would receive the notifications that would destroy their worlds. Each of those 7 deaths represented not just a number in a casualty report, but a life cut short. A person who'd had dreams and plans, and people who loved them, someone who'd never get to experience whatever their life might have been if they had survived Vietnam. 11 South Vietnamese soldiers had been killed during Somerset Plain, and 8 of those deaths had come from the friendly fire incident when an American artillery round had fallen short. For the families of those 8 ARVN soldiers, for their friends and comrades, the manner of death made the loss even more painful, because they'd been killed by weapons that were supposed to be supporting them, because they died due to a mistake rather than in honorable combat with the enemy. The other 3 ARVN soldiers killed had died during the night battle on August 10th and 11th, when North Vietnamese forces had attacked their position. And while those deaths were tragic, they at least had the dignity of having occurred in actual combat. North Vietnamese casualties, according to American and South Vietnamese body counts, were 181 killed and 4 captured. These numbers were significantly lower than what had been hoped, for when Somerset Plain was planned, significantly lower than the casualties inflicted during Delaware, and they suggested that North Vietnamese forces had largely avoided engagement rather than defending the valley in strength. The 4 prisoners captured provided intelligence about enemy units and intentions, but overall the damage inflicted on North Vietnamese forces in the A Shau Valley during Somerset Plain was modest and wouldn't significantly degrade their ability to continue using the valley for logistics and staging. Beyond the killed, there were wounded, soldiers who'd been shot or hit by shrapnel, or who'd been injured in helicopter crashes, or who'd suffered from heat exhaustion or other medical problems. The wounded were categorized in different ways, some requiring evacuation to hospitals in Japan or back to the United States for long-term care, others treated at field hospitals in Vietnam, and returned to duty after recovery. The psychological wounds, the trauma, and stress and nightmares that would affect many of the men who fought in Somerset Plain weren't counted in any casualty report, but were real nonetheless, and would affect their lives for years or decades after the operation ended. In the after-action reviews following Operation Somerset Plain, American commanders tried to assess what the operation had accomplished and whether the objectives had been met. The primary goal had been to disrupt North Vietnamese logistics in the A Shau Valley, to destroy supplies and facilities, to kill enemy soldiers, and to prevent the valley from being used as a staging area for attacks elsewhere in the Viet Corps. By these measures, Somerset Plain had achieved partial success. Some supplies had been found and destroyed. Some enemy soldiers had been killed. The North Vietnamese had been forced to at least temporarily reduce their activities in the valley while American forces were present. But the operation had fallen short of achieving decisive results. The quantities of supplies destroyed were modest. North Vietnamese forces had largely avoided engagement, preserving their combat power rather than accepting battles they were likely to lose. The valley remained under enemy control and would continue to function as a logistics hub after American forces withdrew. And the cost of the operation, while significantly lower than Delaware, still included 18 Allied soldiers killed and many more wounded, plus the enormous expenditure of resources, including helicopter flight hours and ammunition and supplies that all had to be counted against whatever benefits had been achieved. The fact that American forces could conduct operations in the A Shau Valley with relatively light casualties compared to Delaware was seen as evidence that lessons had been learned, that better planning and preparation and more effective use of firepower could reduce losses even in the most dangerous terrain. The smooth insertion and extraction, the limited helicopter losses, the ability to operate for 2 weeks without being decisively engaged by enemy forces, all of this demonstrated tactical competence and operational capability. But whether these tactical successes translated into strategic progress toward winning the war remained an open question that Somerset Plain didn't answer. The performance of South Vietnamese forces during the operation was assessed as generally positive, with ARVN units conducting effective patrols and defending their positions when attacked, though the friendly fire incident and other challenges highlighted continuing problems with combined operations and with South Vietnamese capabilities. For American commanders who were increasingly focused on Vietnamization, on building South Vietnamese forces to the point where they could assume full combat responsibilities, Somerset Plain provided evidence that progress was being made, but also that significant work remained. For the individual soldiers who fought in Operation Somerset Plain, the operation's strategic significance or lack thereof was less important than the personal experience of having survived and having returned to base camps where they could rest and recover before the next operation. The days following extraction from the A Shau Valley were spent cleaning weapons and equipment, writing letters home, sleeping, eating hot food, doing all the normal things that soldiers in base camps did between operations. Some soldiers went to the enlisted club to drink beer and try to forget what they'd experienced in the valley. Others just slept, catching up on the rest they'd missed during 2 weeks of operating on half sleep or less. Unit cohesion remained strong after Somerset Plain, the bonds that had been formed or reinforced during the operation, continuing in the base camp environment. Soldiers who'd fought together in the A Shau Valley remained tight, looked out for each other, shared the unspoken understanding that came from having faced danger together and survived. New soldiers arriving to replace casualties or to fill out units that were under strength were absorbed into these existing groups. Veterans teaching new guys the things they needed to know to survive, passing on the hard-won lessons that couldn't be learned in training stateside, but that made the difference between life and death in Vietnam. For soldiers whose tours were ending, whose rotation dates were coming up, Somerset Plain might have been their last operation before going home. The transition from combat soldier to civilian was jarring, from an environment where your life was constantly in danger to an environment where the biggest challenge was traffic or paying bills or deciding what to have for dinner. Many veterans struggled with this transition, found civilian life boring or meaningless compared to the intensity of combat, missed the camaraderie and sense of purpose that came from being part of a unit where everyone depended on each other. Some veterans would re-enlist, would go back to Vietnam for second or third tours, would chase that intensity because civilian life could never match it. Others wanted nothing more than to leave the Army and leave Vietnam behind, to go home and forget about the war and live normal lives. But forgetting was harder than it seemed. The memories of Somerset Plain, of the A Shau Valley, of firefights and casualties and fear and exhaustion, these memories didn't fade just because you rotated home. They stayed with you, came back in nightmares, were triggered by sounds or smells or situations that reminded you of Vietnam. Many Somerset Plain veterans would struggle with what would later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in '68 and '69, that term wasn't in common use, and veterans were mostly left to deal with their trauma on their own. Operation Somerset Plain took place during a pivotal period in the Vietnam War, when the strategic situation was evolving in ways that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The Tet Offensive earlier in the year had been a military defeat for communist forces, but a psychological and political victory that had shattered American confidence in the war. President Johnson had announced he wouldn't seek re-election. Peace talks had begun in Paris, though they would make little progress. The presidential campaign was underway with candidates debating what to do about Vietnam, and American public opinion was increasingly divided between those who wanted to win the war and those who wanted to withdraw. In this context, operations like Somerset Plain were increasingly questioned back home. What was being achieved by sending soldiers into the A Shau Valley to conduct 2-week raids that didn't produce lasting results? Why were American soldiers still dying in a war that seemed to have no clear path to victory? How many more operations would be conducted before someone admitted that the strategy that wasn't working? These questions were being asked by anti-war protesters, by some members of Congress, by journalists covering the war, and increasingly by the American public, who'd been told for years that progress was being made, but who no longer believed it after Tet. For military commanders in Vietnam, the strategic debates happening in Washington were less important than the tactical realities of fighting the war they'd been sent to fight. The A Shau Valley remained strategically important to North Vietnamese logistics regardless of American political debates. Disrupting enemy operations in the valley remained a valid military objective even if that disruption was temporary, and soldiers would continue to be sent on operations like Somerset Plain, because that's what the mission required, regardless of whether those operations would ultimately contribute to winning the war. The reality was that the war in Vietnam couldn't be won through military operations alone, that the political dimension, including building a legitimate South Vietnamese government and winning the support of the South Vietnamese people, was equally important, and that American strategy had never adequately addressed these political challenges. Operations like Somerset Plain could inflict casualties on North Vietnamese forces and could disrupt their logistics, but these tactical successes didn't address the fundamental problem that the North Vietnamese were willing to accept casualties and continue fighting, that they had sanctuaries in Laos and Cambodia where American forces couldn't follow, and that time was on their side as American political will to continue the war gradually eroded. Operation Somerset Plain occupies a relatively minor place in Vietnam War history, overshadowed by larger operations and more dramatic battles, not well remembered by anyone except the soldiers who fought it and the families of those who died. But for those who were there, Somerset Plain remains. Significant, remains part of their war experience and part of their personal history. The 17 days in August '68 when they operated in the A Shau Valley, when they patrolled through jungles so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet, when they dealt with heat and fear and exhaustion, when they watched helicopters land and take off knowing that enemy anti-aircraft gunners might open fire at any moment, all of this shaped who they became and how they understood their service. The operation demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of American military power in Vietnam. The capability to insert forces anywhere helicopters could fly, to provide massive fire support, to operate in the most difficult terrain. All of this was real and impressive. But the inability to achieve lasting control of areas like the A Shau Valley, the enemy's ability to avoid decisive engagement and to resume operations once American forces withdrew, the disconnect between tactical success and strategic progress, all of this was equally real and demonstrated that military power alone couldn't win the kind of war Vietnam had become. For historians studying the Vietnam War, Somerset Plain provides a case study in the challenges of combined operations, in the difficulties of fighting a mobile enemy who controlled the timing of engagements, in the role of terrain in shaping tactical possibilities, and in the broader strategic problems that plagued American efforts throughout the war. The operation is also remembered for the friendly fire incident that killed 8 South Vietnamese soldiers, a tragic reminder of the inherent risks of combined operations, and of the fog of war that could turn friendly weapons into threats to Allied forces. Operation Somerset Plain, August 4th through 20th, 1968. 17 days in the A Shau Valley, 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division, plus ARVN 1st Division elements. 7 Americans killed, 11 South Vietnamese. Killed. 181 North Vietnamese killed. An operation that achieved its immediate tactical objectives, but that didn't fundamentally alter the situation in the valley where North Vietnamese forces continued to operate. For the 7 Americans killed during Somerset Plain, for Specialist Michael Torres, who'd sat in that helicopter on August 4th, wondering if he'd be one of the casualties, the operation ended their wars and their lives. Their names are inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. Panel after panel of names representing lives cut short by a war that remains controversial decades later. For the survivors, Somerset Plain became part of their war story, one operation among many, memorable because of the A Shau Valley's reputation, but not fundamentally different from the other operations they fought during their tours. The A Shau Valley remains today. The jungle has reclaimed whatever scars Somerset Plain left, the trails and roads the north. Vietnamese built are overgrown. The bunkers and fighting positions have collapsed or been consumed by vegetation. The valley that was so dangerous in '68 is now peaceful, visited by tourists who want to see where battles were fought, who want to understand what happened during the war. For veterans of Somerset Plain who might visit the valley decades later, the experience is surreal, seeing in daylight and in peace a place they remember in darkness and in fear, a place that once wanted to kill them, and that now seems almost benign. This was Operation Somerset Plain, a return to the Valley of Death, an operation that sent thousands of soldiers into one of the most dangerous places in Vietnam, that brought most of them back alive, though changed by the experience, that cost 18 Allied lives, that disrupted North Vietnamese operations temporarily, and that in the end was one more chapter in the long story of American involvement in Vietnam, a story that would continue for several more years before ending in withdrawal and in a North Vietnamese victory that made all the operations and all the casualties seem meaningless to those who questioned whether the war should have been fought at all.